The Elegance of Ms. Ruth Bennett, A Journey to Remember. The warm glow of the early morning sun filtered through the bustling terminals of Brighton International Airport. Among the travelers stood Ms. Ruth Bennett, a dignified elderly black woman in her late 70s, patiently waiting for her turn to board. Dressed in a tasteful charcoal dress with a soft ivory cardigan draped over her shoulders, Ruth's presence exuded quiet elegance. A string of pearls rested gently against her collarbone, and her silver curls peeked neatly from beneath a delicate navy hat. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather handbag, a cherished keepsake from her late husband. This trip was more than just a vacation for Ruth. It marked her first flight in over 30 years, and her long-awaited chance to finally visit her great-grandchildren. The thought of holding them, hearing their laughter, and sharing stories in person filled her heart with nervous excitement. Though Ruth hadn't flown in decades, her son, David Bennett, had insisted she experience the comfort of Horizon Blue Airlines, a luxury carrier he often praised. "Mom, you deserve to relax for once," David had said, smiling warmly as he booked her a first-class ticket. "Let them take care of you this time." At first, Ruth hesitated. Indulgence wasn't in her nature, but eventually, she accepted her son's kindness. As she waited in line, she observed the polished, well-dressed passengers around her. Their quiet glances and brief whispers didn't escape her attention, but Ruth had long since learned to rise above such things. Her focus remained on the ticket in her hand, Seat 2A. A soft smile tugged at her lips. She was thrilled at the thought of sitting near the front, a rare treat she never imagined experiencing. When the boarding call for her group echoed through the terminal, Ruth stepped forward with grace, undeterred by the hurried shuffle of passengers around her. She offered her ticket to the gate attendant with a gentle smile. The attendant scanned it, but hesitated for a brief moment before handing it back. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said, her tone polite yet noticeably distant. Ruth simply nodded, unwilling to let the strained interaction dampen her excitement. As she crossed the jet bridge, the luxurious interior of the aircraft shimmered beneath the soft overhead lights. Plush, cream-colored seats and polished accents surrounded her. Ruth paused for a moment, allowing herself to appreciate the indulgence. After years of putting others first, she allowed herself this one luxury. She reached her seat, 2A, a window seat. Carefully placing her handbag beneath her feet, she retrieved her modest carry-on. Just as she prepared to lift it into the overhead compartment, a clipped voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am," came the sharp tone from the aisle. Ruth turned to see Hannah Foster, the lead flight attendant, standing a few feet away. In her late 30s, Hannah was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried the signature confidence of Horizon Blue Airlines crew. Her dark blue uniform was pristine, but the thin line of her lips betrayed an underlying irritation. "Is this your seat?" Hannah asked, eyeing Ruth with subtle scrutiny. "Yes, dear. Seat 2A, Ruth replied, holding up her boarding pass with quiet poise. Hannah leaned in, eyes narrowing as she examined the pass. After a brief pause, she gave a tight nod. "Fine," she said curtly. "Please stow your bag quickly. We need to keep the line moving." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the compartment again. It wasn't frailty, simply nerves from navigating such an unfamiliar environment. The luxury, the unfamiliarity, it was all a bit overwhelming. Hannah's arms crossed, and she let out an audible sigh, her frustration noticeable to nearby passengers. "Do you need help?" Hannah asked, though her tone made it clear that she hoped the answer was no. Before Ruth could respond, a young man seated across the aisle stood with a warm smile. "I've got it, ma'am," he said softly, gently taking the bag from Ruth's hands and sliding it into the overhead bin. Ruth smiled, warmth radiating from her eyes. "Thank you, young man. That's very kind of you." As the man returned to his seat, Ruth noticed Hannah's expression darken slightly. "Let's not hold up the line," Hannah muttered, stepping back. Ruth sat down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. The glances from other passengers didn't faze her. She had endured much worse over the years. Instead, she gazed out the window, focusing on the clouds beyond the tarmac. As the remaining passengers boarded, Hannah continued her rounds, occasionally glancing in Ruth's direction. The air of tension lingered, though Ruth remained calm. She had faced prejudice and dismissiveness before. What Hannah didn't realize was that Ruth Bennett was far more than she appeared. And this quiet, elderly woman was about to change everything. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 2. Ruth Bennett sat quietly in her seat, her hands resting gracefully on her lap as the hum of conversation filled the cabin. Around her, the other passengers chatted softly or scrolled through their phones, but Ruth could sense the subtle glances cast her way. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few held a faint discomfort, as if her presence disrupted the unspoken rhythm of the first-class cabin. She had long learned not to let the stares of others shape her sense of worth. Ruth carried herself with a quiet dignity, knowing that her value wasn't dictated by fleeting judgments. Yet, Hannah Foster, the lead flight attendant, seemed intent on making sure Ruth felt out of place. As Hannah strode down the aisle, her eyes would flicker toward Ruth, lingering just long enough to convey a coldness Ruth couldn't ignore. Ruth shifted her focus, drawing her thoughts toward the warm embrace that awaited her at the end of the journey. Her great-grandchildren would be there, their laughter echoing in the house as she shared stories from long ago. The thought brought a smile to her lips, though it did little to ease the weight of Hannah's unwelcome attention. Ruth had faced prejudice many times throughout her life, and though she carried the strength to rise above it, each moment left its mark. What no one on that plane realized was that Ruth's quiet presence would soon set off a chain of events that would reshape the very airline they were flying on. As the final boarding announcements wrapped up, the crew began preparations for takeoff. Ruth noticed her seatbelt wouldn't fasten properly. With gentle effort, she tried adjusting it, but the latch resisted. Unwilling to risk her safety, she pressed the call button. Moments later, Hannah approached, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stopped beside Ruth's row. Her expression, already impatient, hardened further. "What is it now?" Hannah asked, her tone clipped and laced with irritation. Ruth met her gaze with a kind, unwavering smile. "I believe my seatbelt may be stuck. Would you mind helping me, dear?" Hannah exhaled loudly, ensuring the nearby passengers could hear her frustration. She leaned in, tugged briefly at the seatbelt, and stood back with a dismissive shrug. "There's nothing wrong with it," she replied flatly. "You just need to pull harder." Ruth adjusted the belt herself, offering a soft "thank you, dear." Without another word, Hannah spun on her heel and marched down the aisle, muttering under her breath. "Special requests already. This is going to be a long flight." Though Hannah's words were hushed, they carried far enough to draw disapproving glances from other passengers. Ruth, however, remained composed. She wasn't about to let irritation take root in her heart. A few minutes passed before Ruth realized she had forgotten to take her medication. She hesitated, her eyes glancing toward the aisle where Hannah stood chatting with another crew member. Ruth disliked the idea of troubling Hannah again, but her health couldn't wait. With a quiet resolve, she pressed the call button once more. Hannah's return was swift, but her annoyance was palpable. Arms crossed and lips pursed, she stared down at Ruth. "Yes?" Hannah asked curtly. "I apologize for bothering you," Ruth said softly, "but may I have a small cup of water to take my medication?" Hannah let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. "We're not even in the air yet, ma'am. Water service doesn't begin until after takeoff. You'll have to wait." "It's just for my medicine," Ruth explained gently. "I won't need anything else." With clear reluctance, Hannah disappeared into the galley, returning moments later with a small plastic cup. She set it down on Ruth's tray table with such force that the loud clatter drew the attention of several nearby passengers. "Thank you," Ruth said, as gracefully as ever. She took her medication, ignoring the tension lingering around her. But Hannah wasn't done. A short while later, she returned, this time accompanied by another flight attendant. Standing over Ruth, arms crossed tightly, Hannah projected an air of authority. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, raising her voice enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Are you sure you're in the correct seat? This section is for premium passengers." Ruth looked up, her calm expression unchanged. "Yes, dear. I believe I am. My ticket says 2A. She held up the pass. Hannah snatched it from her hand, squinting at it before returning it grudgingly. "Well, it seems you're in the right place," she said stiffly. "Next time, please ensure you board with the correct group. Procedures matter." Ruth blinked slowly. "I did board with my assigned group," she replied, voice soft but certain. Hannah muttered something under her breath, something about not belonging and slowing things down, and turned away. Ruth's heart sank, though she kept her gaze fixed on the window. A few moments later, Hannah returned yet again, addressing Ruth in a tone better suited for a child. "Ma'am, you need to keep your handbag under the seat in front of you at all times," she said firmly. Ruth glanced down, confused. "It's already under the seat, dear." Hannah peered down, realizing her mistake. Instead of apologizing, she brushed it off. "Just keep it there. I'll be checking." Passengers whispered to one another, clearly noting the unnecessary hostility. Across the aisle, a young woman leaned over and whispered to Ruth. "Don't mind her, ma'am. She's been like this since boarding. You've done nothing wrong." Ruth smiled softly. "Thank you, dear." Despite the coldness, Ruth held her head high. But as the flight continued, it became clear that Hannah's actions would not go unnoticed. And Ruth's quiet strength was about to spark change far beyond the cabin walls. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 3. Ruth Bennett tucked her small handbag neatly under the seat in front of her, folding her hands gently in her lap. "Ma'am, your bag needs to stay under the seat at all times," came the firm voice of Hannah Foster. Ruth glanced down, slightly puzzled. "It's already there, dear," she replied kindly, pointing to the bag resting beneath her feet. Hannah's eyes followed Ruth's gesture, and upon realizing her mistake, she straightened abruptly. Instead of acknowledging the error, Hannah responded stiffly. "Well, just keep it that way. I'll be checking." Passengers nearby exchanged quiet glances, their whispered conversations reflecting the growing discomfort with Hannah's behavior. A young woman across the aisle leaned in slightly and spoke softly to Ruth. "Don't mind her, ma'am. She's been acting like this since we boarded. You've done nothing wrong." Ruth turned to the woman with a warm, grateful smile. "Thank you, dear. I appreciate that." Still, the weight of Hannah's hostility lingered, heavy and unrelenting. It was clear to everyone watching that Ruth had been singled out for reasons beyond her control. As the aircraft engines hummed to life, Ruth took a deep breath and closed her eyes, centering herself in the thought of the joy waiting for her. Soon, she would be with her great-grandchildren, their tiny hands wrapped around hers, their laughter echoing through the house. The anticipation filled her heart, making the discomfort of this flight worth every moment. But what Ruth didn't know was that this was only the beginning of Hannah's behavior. As the plane lifted off, Ruth lost herself in the view beyond the window. The soft blanket of clouds and the endless blue stretched before her, a peaceful distraction from the tension within the cabin. Hannah, meanwhile, began her rounds with the beverage cart. To Ruth's quiet observation, Hannah's interactions with the other passengers were smooth, polite, even friendly. Glasses of sparkling water and small cups of juice were handed out effortlessly, met with warm smiles. But as the cart neared Ruth's row, Hannah's expression hardened once more. "Excuse me," Ruth said softly as Hannah approached. "Could I please have a small cup of water?" Hannah's hand hovered over the tray, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Water?" she repeated as though the request were absurd. "Yes, dear, just a little," Ruth responded, her tone unwavering. Hannah placed one hand on her hip, tilting her head. "Ma'am, this isn't a charity," she said, her voice louder than necessary. Heads turned, and the low murmur of conversation faded as passengers glanced toward Ruth's row. A faint flush rose to Ruth's cheeks, but her composure remained intact. She had faced moments like this before. "I'm sorry if I've inconvenienced you," she said gently. "I simply need to stay hydrated for my health." The middle-aged man seated behind Ruth shifted uncomfortably. "That was uncalled for," he muttered just loud enough for Ruth to hear. Ruth lifted her gaze to meet Hannah's eyes, her soft smile betraying no hint of anger. Hannah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to the flight attendant beside her and muttered sarcastically, "I guess we're running a water drive now." A faint chuckle followed, but the cruelty in her tone did not go unnoticed. Before Ruth could reply, a small voice from across the aisle. "You can have mine, ma'am." Ruth turned to see a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, holding out a half-full bottle of water. The child's large, bright eyes radiated kindness and innocence. "I don't need it," the girl added earnestly. Ruth's heart swelled with gratitude. She reached out gently, accepting the bottle with a warm smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. You are very kind." The girl's parents nodded toward Ruth, pride gleaming in their eyes as they watched the small act of compassion unfold. Across the aisle, Hannah's expression stiffened. Her jaw tightened, her cheeks flushing as the quiet support for Ruth rippled through the cabin. "Let's keep the aisle clear," Hannah barked, shoving the beverage cart forward with unnecessary force. Ruth twisted the cap off the bottle and took a small sip, the cool water soothing the dryness in her throat. She set the bottle carefully on her tray table, her hands steady despite the weight of the encounter. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the girl's mother asked gently, leaning closer. Ruth nodded softly. "I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for raising such a thoughtful little girl." The mother smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back affectionately. "She learns by example," she said with a touch of pride. Despite Ruth's calm, Hannah's frustration simmered beneath the surface. As she resumed her duties, her movements grew sharper, and her glances toward Ruth became more frequent. It was clear she resented the support Ruth had garnered from those around her. But Ruth remained unfazed. She had weathered far greater storms than this, and no amount of bitterness could shake the peace she carried within her. Little did Hannah know, her actions were being watched, not just by the passengers but by those who had the power to change the course of her career. Ruth's quiet dignity was about to set something much larger into motion. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 4. Ruth Bennett sat silently by the window, the soft hum of the plane and the endless stretch of blue sky offering her a brief moment of calm. Despite the simmering tension in the cabin, she refused to let it disturb her. She had faced far greater storms in her lifetime, and she knew that grace and patience often triumphed. At the end of this journey, warm embraces from her great-grandchildren awaited. Their smiles, their tiny hands wrapped around hers, those moments made any discomfort she faced now worth enduring. But as Ruth rested, Hannah Foster's sharp gaze repeatedly drifted toward her. From the front of the cabin, Hannah watched Ruth with narrowed eyes, her irritation growing. She had tried to make Ruth feel out of place, but the elderly woman's calm resolve, along with the quiet support from nearby passengers, only fueled Hannah's frustration. Several passengers had noticed. A few, disturbed by Hannah's behavior, began subtly recording the interactions on their phones. Snippets of Hannah's dismissive tone and pointed hostility were captured, small fragments of a much larger picture forming right under her nose. They didn't know Ruth's full story, but they saw enough to recognize mistreatment, and they weren't going to let it pass unnoticed. But Hannah remained oblivious to the growing discontent around her. Ruth's grace seemed to agitate her even more. The kindness shown by the young girl offering water, the murmurs of sympathy from others, it all unnerved Hannah. She had expected compliance, not quiet resistance. Standing near the galley, Hannah glanced down the aisle once more. There Ruth sat, peacefully gazing out the window. To Hannah, this wasn't just a passenger. It was a disruption, a challenge to her authority. With sharp, purposeful strides, Hannah marched down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. The quiet cabin stirred as she stopped abruptly by Ruth's row, her arms crossed. "Ma'am," Hannah said loudly, cutting through the low hum of the cabin, "I need you to come with me now." Ruth turned her head, blinking up at Hannah with soft curiosity. "Is something the matter, dear?" she asked, her voice steady but kind. Hannah's lips pressed into a thin line. "You've been causing a disturbance since boarding. I've given you multiple chances to follow instructions, but you continue to ignore them." Passengers exchanged confused glances. A middle-aged man in the row behind Ruth frowned, shaking his head. "I haven't seen her disturb anyone," he muttered quietly to his seatmate. Ruth's brow furrowed. "I don't understand," she said gently. "I've simply been sitting here, minding my own business." Hannah's tone sharpened. "You've pressed the call button unnecessarily, disrupting my duties, and now you're refusing to cooperate. This behavior is unacceptable." More murmurs rippled through the cabin, a quiet chorus of disbelief. Ruth opened her mouth to respond, but Hannah spun on her heel before she could speak, heading swiftly to the front of the plane. Picking up the intercom, Hannah's voice filled the cabin. "Captain, we have a disruptive passenger in 2A. I'm requesting immediate removal before takeoff." A hush fell over the cabin, broken by gasps of disbelief. She hasn't done anything, the man behind Ruth called out. This is ridiculous. Another woman, seated further down the aisle, began recording on her phone, her lips pursed in frustration. This isn't right, she whispered as she filmed. Despite the rising tide of discontent, Hannah carried on as if nothing were amiss. Moments later, 2 airport security officers entered the cabin, their presence turning heads. With a smug expression, Hannah gestured toward Ruth. That's her, she said simply. Ruth's heart dipped slightly, but she kept her composure. Slowly, she reached for her handbag, tucking it neatly under her arm. As the officers approached, their expressions softened when they saw the elderly woman standing calmly before them. Ma'am, we need you to come with us, one of the officers said gently. Ruth nodded, her chin held high. Of course, dear. Turning to the passengers around her, she offered a faint, apologetic smile. I'm sorry for any inconvenience, she said softly, though she knew in her heart she had done nothing wrong. As she stepped into the aisle, several passengers voiced their protest. This isn't right, one man called out. She's done nothing to deserve this, said another. Further down, the young girl who had offered Ruth her water tugged at her mother's sleeve, eyes wide with concern. Mommy, why are they taking her? She's nice? The girl's mother leaned down, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. Sometimes, sweetheart, people are treated unfairly, she explained in a soft but firm tone. But don't worry, we won't let this go unnoticed. Ruth walked down the aisle with unwavering grace, her steps slow but steady. Hannah stood near the cockpit, her arms crossed, eyes gleaming with satisfaction as Ruth passed. But what Hannah didn't realize was that nearly every phone in that cabin was now capturing her actions. And though Ruth left the plane without resistance, the story of what happened on Flight 709 was far from over. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 5. Several passengers had discreetly recorded the entire incident, capturing Hannah Foster's sharp tone and Ruth Bennett's unwavering grace. The injustice was unmistakable. As Ruth stepped off the plane, the 2 airport security officers guided her to a quiet seating area near the terminal's far end at Portsmouth International Airport. One of the officers, noticing Ruth's calm but weary expression, offered a soft smile. Ma'am, we're just following protocol. If you'd like to file a complaint, we can assist with that, he said gently. Ruth gave a small nod, her voice steady but touched with exhaustion. Thank you, dear. I appreciate it. Back on the plane, Hannah resumed her duties, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. What she failed to realize was that passengers who had witnessed the incident were already taking steps to report her behavior. And Hannah certainly didn't know that Ruth was far more than the modestly dressed elderly woman she appeared to be. Hannah's smug satisfaction would be short-lived. As Ruth sat quietly in the terminal, her thoughts drifted between sadness and reflection. She had never been the kind of person to demand special treatment or raise her voice in protest. Dignity, patience, and kindness had guided her through life. But even she couldn't ignore the sting of what had just happened. With a soft sigh, Ruth reached into her handbag and retrieved her phone. For a moment she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Ruth had spent years living a simple, humble life, far removed from the spotlight her son's success had brought. Ethan Bennett, CEO of Summit Sky Airlines, had always been her pride and joy, but Ruth had never used his name for leverage. Today, however, was different. Dialing a familiar number, Ruth waited as the phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. Hey, Mom, Ethan's voice echoed warmly. Is everything okay? Shouldn't you be on the flight by now? Ruth's tone remained calm, though fatigue lingered at the edges. No, son, I'm not on the flight, she replied softly. The other end of the line went silent for a moment before Ethan's voice returned, sharp and alert. What? Why? What happened? Ruth hesitated. She didn't want to upset him, but he needed to know the truth. The flight attendant. I suppose she didn't care for the way I looked, Ruth explained gently. She said I was disruptive. I didn't argue, I just left. A sharp breath crackled through the phone. Mom, are you serious? This happened on one of my planes? Yes, Ethan. I didn't want to make a fuss, but I thought you should know. This isn't just about me. No one should be treated that way. Ethan's voice dropped, steady but brimming with restrained anger. Did she give you her name? Her name was Hannah Foster, I believe, Ruth replied. Ethan's voice sharpened. I'll handle it. Right now. I'm fine, son. I'm sitting near gate 9. Don't worry, Ruth reassured him. I'll call you back, Ethan said, his voice cold and firm. As Ruth hung up, she felt a pang of guilt at the thought of her son being upset. But deep down, she knew this could spark meaningful change, not just for her but for others who might face similar treatment. Meanwhile, chaos rippled through Summit Sky Airlines headquarters. Ethan Bennett's call to the operations center set off a chain of rapid events. At her desk, Clara Reynolds, the senior operations manager, answered the phone. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," Clara greeted, professional as always. "Not a good evening, Clara," Ethan snapped. "I just received a troubling call. My mother, Ruth Bennett, was mistreated and removed from one of our flights. I need answers, now." Clara's face paled. "Your mother?" she stammered, already typing furiously to pull up the flight records. "Yes, my mother," Ethan confirmed. "I know she keeps our connection quiet to avoid special treatment, but that's no excuse for what happened today. I need to know who was responsible and why this wasn't escalated to me immediately." "Yes, sir," Clara replied, her hands trembling slightly. Within moments, the flight logs appeared on her screen. Clara's eyes scanned the details, her expression tightening. The lead flight attendant was Hannah Foster. She reported Mrs. Wright Bennett as disruptive and requested removal before takeoff. Ethan's voice darkened. "Disruptive? My mother?" Clara hesitated. "Sir, several passengers submitted complaints about Miss Foster during boarding. I'm also seeing early reports from passengers who recorded the incident. I'm retrieving the footage now, but it doesn't look good." "Unfairly treated?" Ethan growled through clenched teeth. "I'm afraid so, sir. Send me everything, the complaints, the videos. I want it all on my desk within the hour. And Clara, detain Hannah Foster when that plane lands. I want to speak with her personally." "Understood, sir." As the call ended, Clara immediately notified the ground crew at Portsmouth International. Security was dispatched to meet the flight upon landing. Back at his office, Ethan leaned back in his chair, taking a steady breath. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, calm and full of grace, even in the face of humiliation. But this wasn't just about Ruth. Ethan knew his mother wouldn't seek revenge, but it was about principle, respect, and ensuring that no one, especially someone like Ruth, would ever experience such blatant mistreatment again. With that thought in mind, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed for the airport. This wasn't over. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 6. As Ethan Bennett ended the call, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His mother's voice still lingered in his mind. Steady, graceful, even in the face of humiliation. Ruth Bennett had always taught him that dignity was a choice, no matter the circumstances. But this wasn't just about Ruth. It was about ensuring that no one else experienced such blatant discrimination on one of his flights. Ethan picked up his phone again. "I want a full review of our employee conduct policies," he instructed his legal team. "Effective immediately. I expect recommendations for changes on my desk by tomorrow morning. This won't happen again, not on my watch." Back at Portsmouth International Airport, Ruth sat quietly near Gate 9, her hands gently folded in her lap. A few passengers who had witnessed the ordeal approached her. A young woman knelt beside Ruth's chair, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "I'm so sorry for what happened," she said softly. "I sent the video I took to Summit Sky Airlines already. They need to know this isn't right." Ruth smiled warmly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, dear. Kindness like yours gives me hope." Little did Ruth know, Ethan was already setting plans into motion. Plans that wouldn't just address the injustice she faced, but would shake Summit Sky Airlines to its core. Back on the plane, Hannah Foster strolled confidently down the aisle, her head held high. She inspected the rows with exaggerated precision, her smile thin and satisfied. To Hannah, this was a victory, a reassertion of control. She had dealt with Ruth in the way she thought necessary, and now the flight could proceed as planned. Her satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Just as the plane was preparing to taxi to the runway, Hannah's name was called over the intercom. "Miss Hannah Foster, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." Frowning, Hannah exchanged glances with the junior flight attendant beside her, confusion flickering across her face. She adjusted her uniform and made her way briskly to the front of the plane. Waiting at the entrance were two uniformed security officers. One of them gestured toward the jet bridge leading back to the terminal. "Miss Foster," the officer said firmly, "we need you to step off the plane with us." Hannah's eyes narrowed. "What? Why?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Her gaze darted to the pilot, but he avoided eye contact. The other flight attendants shifted uncomfortably in their spots. No one spoke up. "This isn't up for debate," the officer replied. "Please come with us immediately." Muttering under her breath, Hannah complied, following the officers out of the cabin. Her steps were quick, but her mind raced. As she stepped into the terminal, her eyes widened at the sight awaiting her. A small group stood by the gate, the airline's legal team, a few senior staff members, and at the center of it all was Ethan Bennett himself. His presence was unmistakable. The CEO's sharp gaze fixed on Hannah as she approached, her confidence flickering under the weight of his stare. For a moment, Hannah hesitated, but she quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Bennett," she began, forcing a polite smile, "I'm not sure what's going on, but I have a flight to manage." Ethan raised his hand, silencing her immediately. His expression was cold, his words precise. "Miss Foster, do you know who the passenger was that you removed from the flight?" Hannah blinked. Well, she was causing a disturbance, sir." Pressing the call button unnecessarily, refusing to follow instructions. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "That passenger was my mother." The color drained from Hannah's face. "Your mother?" she stammered. "Yes, Ruth Bennett," Ethan continued, his tone cutting. "The woman you humiliated, mistreated, and falsely accused, and I am here to ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions." Hannah's composure crumbled. "Mr. Bennett, I was just following protocol," she said weakly. "I didn't mean to." Ethan stepped forward, his glare unwavering. "Do you think I'd rely solely on my mother's account?" he asked icily. "I've reviewed the security footage, listened to passenger testimonies, and watched videos taken on board. Every piece of evidence confirms that your behavior was not only unprofessional, but cruel and discriminatory." Hannah's hands trembled as she struggled to form a defense. "I thought she was being disruptive." "You thought wrong," Ethan snapped. "You targeted her based on appearance, refused to assist her, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. That's not protocol, Miss Foster. That's prejudice." Hannah's gaze darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But there were no allies to be found. The legal team remained silent. The operations manager's expression hardened with disapproval, and the security officers stood firm. Ethan's voice broke the silence once more. "I have zero tolerance for behavior like yours. Not only have you embarrassed this airline, but you've tarnished the reputation we strive to uphold." His words echoed like a final verdict. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 7. Ethan Bennett's voice cut through the terminal like cold steel. "As of this moment, you are fired." Hannah Foster's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Fired? But I've been with Summit Sky Airlines for years." "I can, and I will," Ethan interrupted, his expression unflinching. "Your years of service do not excuse your behavior. You have no place here." Hannah's protests turned frantic. "Mr. Bennett, please. I didn't mean..." Ethan raised his hand once more, his voice final. "This conversation is over." He turned to the security officers. "Escort her out of the terminal. Ensure she doesn't set foot on another one of our flights." The officers stepped forward. One of them held out a clipboard. "You'll need to sign this form acknowledging your termination," the officer said curtly. Hannah's hands trembled as she signed, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. She removed her ID badge and uniform jacket, handing them over without another word. As the officers led her toward the exit, Hannah's head hung low, a shadow of her former self. Meanwhile, Ruth Bennett sat quietly in the serene Summit Sky VIP lounge, a space her son had arranged for her as soon as he learned of the incident. The weight of the day lingered as she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to memories both sweet and painful. Ruth had grown up in the rural South during a time when segregation was woven deeply into society's fabric. As a young girl, she remembered the harsh whites-only signs that barred her and her family from entering certain establishments. She could still feel her mother's firm grip on her hand as they passed restaurants they weren't allowed to enter, and schools she was forbidden to attend. But one memory stood out most vividly. She had been 9 years old, standing in line at Thompson's General Store with her father. After saving her pennies for weeks, Ruth was eager to buy a small notebook for school. When it was their turn, the store owner, a large man with rough features, snatched the notebook from her tiny hands. "We don't sell to your kind," he growled. Her father, a dignified and quiet man, gently took Ruth's hand and led her out of the store without uttering a word. But as they walked, Ruth noticed the glimmer of tears in his eyes. That image stayed with her. It fueled something within her, a quiet but burning resolve to rise above prejudice and injustice. As Ruth grew older, life's challenges only grew steeper. She married young to Samuel Bennett, a kind-hearted man who shared her vision of building a better life for their children. Samuel worked as a factory laborer while Ruth cleaned houses for wealthy families. The work was grueling. Often, she felt invisible, or worse, as though her worth was diminished in the eyes of those she worked for. One day, as she dusted shelves in a grand house, she overheard the homeowner speaking to guests. "People like her," the woman said dismissively, "don't need education or ambition. They're meant to serve, and that's all." Ruth said nothing. But as she scrubbed the floors that afternoon, she made a solemn vow. "My children will never hear words like these." She whispered to herself, "They will have the opportunities I never did. I'll make sure of it." That promise became Ruth's life mission. She worked double shifts, often skipping meals to save money for her children's education. She encouraged them to dream big, reminding them daily that their worth was not defined by others, but by their own integrity and hard work. Her son, Ethan, was bright and full of curiosity from the start. Ruth still remembered the day he raced home from school, waving a notebook filled with sketches of airplanes. "Mama, I'm going to build planes one day," he declared proudly. Ruth smiled, brushing his hair gently. "Then you'd better work hard, baby," she told him. "Dreaming is free, but success comes at a price." Ethan took those words to heart. He excelled in school, earning scholarships that led him far from the town Ruth had grown up in. He studied aeronautical engineering and business, eventually rising to the top of the aviation industry. Now as CEO of Summit Sky Airlines, Ethan often credited his success to his mother. At every milestone, he would proudly say, "I stand where I am because of her." But Ruth's journey wasn't without heartbreak. Samuel passed away when Ethan was only 16, leaving Ruth to raise their children alone. Those years were the hardest of her life. Ruth often worked at 3 different houses in a single day just to keep food on the table. Yet she never let despair show. Her home was filled with love, laughter, and hope. Each evening she read stories to Ethan and his siblings, instilling in them the values of perseverance, kindness, and faith. Now, sitting in the quiet lounge, Ruth reflected on the long path that had brought her to this moment. Despite the indignity she had faced earlier, she refused to let bitterness take root. Grace and resilience had carried her this far, and they would continue to do so. Yet today's events had reopened old wounds, if only for a brief moment. As Ruth gazed out the window at the planes beyond the terminal, she reminded herself of something she had long believed. Dignity isn't given by others, it's something we carry within us. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She wasn't defeated. And little did she know, her strength and her son's unwavering determination would lead to lasting change for countless others. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 8. As Ruth Bennett sipped her tea in the quiet Summit Sky VIP lounge, her mind drifted between the past and present. For a fleeting moment, she felt like that 9-year-old girl in Thompson's General Store. Unseen, unwelcome, and unworthy. But Ruth gently reminded herself of the lesson she had passed on to her son long ago. Dignity isn't about how others treat you, it's about how you carry yourself, no matter the circumstance. Straightening her posture, Ruth took another sip of tea, letting the memories settle. The past, though painful at times, was not the end of her story. She had faced adversity before and emerged stronger each time. Little did Ruth know that Ethan Bennett was already setting plans in motion. Plans that would not only address the injustice she had faced, but also spark meaningful change across Summit Sky Airlines. Ethan understood this wasn't just about his mother. It was about the bigger picture, a systemic issue that required immediate attention. The first step Ethan took was ensuring Ruth would be on the next available flight, seated comfortably in first class. He personally called the airline staff, instructing them to welcome her warmly from the gate to her seat, leaving no detail overlooked. At the same time, Ethan crafted a heartfelt apology, not just to Ruth but to all passengers who had witnessed the incident. He knew that addressing the issue privately wasn't enough. This required a public response. Later that evening, Summit Sky Airlines released a formal statement, signed by Ethan himself. "We deeply regret and apologize for the unacceptable treatment of one of our valued passengers, Mrs. Ruth Bennett, by a member of our staff. This behavior does not reflect the values of Summit Sky Airlines. We are committed to addressing this incident with the seriousness it deserves, ensuring that no passenger is ever treated with such disrespect again." Effective immediately, the staff member responsible has been terminated, and mandatory inclusivity and professionalism training will be implemented for all employees. To the passengers on Flight 719, we offer a full refund and a complimentary future flight as compensation for witnessing this distressing incident. To Mrs. Ruth Bennett, we extend our deepest apologies and promise that this will serve as a turning point for our company. The statement spread rapidly across Summit Sky's website and social media channels. Within minutes, it gained attention, but the real momentum began when passengers on the flight shared their experiences online. Videos taken during the flight showed Ruth's calm, unwavering grace as she was escorted off the plane. In stark contrast, Hannah Foster's condescending smirk painted a different picture, one that angered viewers. One video, uploaded by a travel blogger with thousands of followers, was titled, "The Strongest Woman I've Ever Met, A Lesson in Grace Under Pressure." In the video, the blogger praised Ruth's quiet strength. This woman was treated so unfairly, but she never raised her voice. She held her head high and left with dignity. She's a true inspiration. The video quickly went viral, amassing millions of views in just a few hours. Comments poured in from people across the world. "How could anyone treat such a kind woman this way? Ruth Bennett is a queen. I hope she's okay. This is why we need more accountability in customer service. Thank you for speaking out." News outlets seized the story, with headlines such as, "Airline CEO's mother humiliated, and the internet is furious. Grace under fire, elderly woman's poise exposes airline mistreatment." While Ruth remained quietly seated in the lounge, unaware of the growing media storm, Ethan's phone buzzed non-stop with calls from journalists and activists. Some demanded further accountability. Others commended him for his swift and decisive action. Ruth's story quickly became a rallying cry for better treatment of passengers, particularly those often overlooked or underestimated. Advocacy groups hailed Ruth as a symbol of quiet resilience and strength. Yet, Ruth herself stayed grounded. She hadn't sought attention or recognition. She simply wanted to reach her great-grandchildren. When Ethan finally joined her in the lounge, he found her knitting calmly, as if the day's events had been nothing out of the ordinary. Ruth glanced up and smiled softly. "You didn't have to go through all this, you know." Ethan sat down beside her, shaking his head. "Yes, I did, Mama. What happened to you wasn't right. It's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again, to you or anyone else." Ruth sighed gently, setting her knitting aside. "You've always had such a big heart, baby. But remember," she said, her voice steady, "we can't control how others treat us. We can only control how we respond." As always, Ruth's words struck a deep chord within Ethan. He nodded slowly, determination gleaming in his eyes. Her quiet strength had shaped him, and now it would guide the changes he planned to make, not just within the airline, but far beyond it. For a brief moment, Ethan sat in silence, watching his mother's calm resolve. He had always known her to be strong, but today, he saw something more. Ruth wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't seeking revenge or public praise. She was asking for action, real, tangible change. "I want you to transfer ownership of a major share of the airline to me," Ruth said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Mama, what are you saying?" "I want a seat at the table," Ruth replied with certainty. "If I'm going to help fix things, I need to be part of the decision-making, not just in spirit, but in reality." Ethan studied her face for a long moment. Finally, he smiled. "Okay, Mama. If that's what you want, I'll make it happen." The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 9. Ruth Bennett placed her tea down on the glass table, her gaze steady as she looked at her son, Ethan. "I want a seat at the table," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Not just in spirit, but in action. If I'm going to help fix things at Summit Sky Airlines, I need to be part of the decisions being made." Ethan blinked, surprised by his mother's request. His mother, the woman who had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, who had endured hardship with grace and had never asked for recognition, was now asking for a direct role in the company he had built. For a moment, Ethan wasn't sure how to respond, but then he thought about everything Ruth had done for him. Every sacrifice. Every long night she had spent working to give him a future she never had. This wasn't just a request, this was a movement, and Ruth Bennett was ready to lead it. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion, but he nodded. "Okay, Mama," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "If you're sure this is what you want, I'll make it happen. I'll transfer shares to you, enough to make you a primary stakeholder. From now on, you'll have a real voice in this company." For the first time since the incident on the plane, Ruth's face lit up with a warm, full smile. "Thank you, baby. I know this is a big step, but I want to be there for the people who need to see that someone cares about them." The following days were a whirlwind. Ethan wasted no time arranging the legal transfer of a significant portion of Summit Sky Airlines shares to Ruth. The announcement of Ruth Bennett's new role as a primary stakeholder sent shockwaves through the company. Some executives were skeptical. Could someone who had spent most of her life outside the corporate world handle the complexities of running a global airline? But Ethan stood firm. "Her perspective is exactly what we need," he told the board. "She represents the people we serve and the values this airline must uphold." The media reaction was immediate and intense. Many applauded Ruth's courage, calling her a trailblazer for equality and representation. Others, including critics who sympathized with Hannah Foster, were less enthusiastic. But Ruth wasn't concerned with the critics. She had a mission, and now she had the power to carry it out. As Ruth stepped into her new role, she wasted no time driving systemic change. She advocated for comprehensive inclusivity training, not just for flight attendants, but for pilots, ground crew, and executives alike. She pushed for scholarships and internships aimed at underrepresented communities, creating pathways for careers in aviation that hadn't existed before. She partnered with community organizations to foster diversity, ensuring Summit Sky became a leader in equitable hiring practices. Ruth wasn't just sitting at the table. She was reshaping it. Employees across the company felt the shift. The ripple effects of Ruth's leadership could be felt from the bustling gates at Dallas International to the executive boardrooms at corporate headquarters. Summit Sky Airlines was no longer just another airline. It was becoming a symbol of transformation. Passenger satisfaction soared. Employees, especially those from marginalized communities, expressed newfound pride in working for a company that reflected their values. Meanwhile, Hannah Foster's life began to unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. What Hannah had assumed was a minor incident had snowballed into a scandal that defined her name, and not in a good way. Her dismissive, discriminatory behavior toward Ruth struck a nerve with the public. The backlash came swiftly. Social media erupted. The hashtag Justice for Ruth trended for days, accompanied by countless videos and testimonials from passengers on Flight 719. Hannah's personal social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. News outlets reported on her past interactions with customers. Some passengers came forward with their own stories of mistreatment. But the true blow came when Summit Sky Airlines, under Ruth's direction, formally announced Hannah's termination. In an official statement, the airline declared, "Following an internal investigation, we have determined that the actions of Hannah Foster during Flight 719 were unacceptable and do not reflect the values of Summit Sky Airlines. Effective immediately, her contract has been terminated. We remain committed to fostering a culture of respect, inclusivity, and professionalism at all levels of our organization." Despite her termination, Hannah tried to salvage her reputation. She claimed the situation had been blown out of proportion. "I was just following protocol," she said in a public interview. But the public wasn't convinced. The videos, the testimonies, and the overwhelming support for Ruth Bennett told a different story. One Hannah couldn't rewrite. Her name became synonymous with prejudice and poor service. Job offers vanished. Industry connections distanced themselves. While Ruth's quiet dignity inspired millions, Hannah's story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked bias. At Summit Sky Airlines, Ruth continued to lead with grace and determination. She didn't seek personal accolades or attention. Her focus remained on the passengers, the employees, and the communities Summit Sky served. One afternoon, as Ruth walked through the airline's training center, a young flight attendant approached her nervously. "Mrs. Bennett," the woman said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I feel like this company finally sees me." Ruth smiled warmly and placed her hand on the woman's shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted," she replied. In Ruth Bennett's eyes, her work had only just begun. The Quiet Strength of Ruth Bennett, Part 10. Despite the weight of her dismissal, Hannah Foster still failed to grasp the full scope of her actions. She insisted she had been misunderstood, arguing that the incident had been exaggerated by passengers and the media. In interviews, Hannah attempted to portray herself as the victim, claiming the pressures of her job had pushed her to act out of frustration. But her defense fell flat. Summit Sky Airlines released a statement reaffirming that her behavior was unacceptable and would not be tolerated. The public's response echoed this sentiment. The story took on a life of its own. Hannah was no longer just a flight attendant who mistreated a passenger. She became a symbol of the prejudice and discrimination that society was determined to eliminate. As news of her termination spread, Hannah's professional prospects dried up almost overnight. Once, her resume had opened doors in the travel and hospitality industry. Now job offers disappeared, and former connections distanced themselves. No company wanted to risk hiring someone whose name had become synonymous with intolerance. The isolation Hannah experienced was profound. Friends and colleagues, once eager to associate with her, began to quietly drift away. Uncomfortable with the controversy that followed her name, Hannah was left to confront a harsh truth. Her actions had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. While Ruth Bennett's story sparked hope and inspired change, Hannah's became a cautionary tale, one that highlighted the lasting impact of cruelty and prejudice. Meanwhile, Ruth stepped into her new role at Summit Sky Airlines with quiet determination. She wasn't just a symbolic figurehead. Ruth approached her work with a clear vision, driven by a steadfast commitment to diversity, inclusion, and respect at every level of the company. Her presence at the airline's headquarters served as a constant reminder of the transformation taking place. But it wasn't just her presence that left an impression. Ruth's actions spoke louder than words. She implemented mandatory training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and inclusive communication for all employees, from ground crew to pilots to top executives. She championed diversity in hiring, ensuring representation across all departments, fostering opportunities for underrepresented groups. Ruth forged partnerships with community organizations to build pipelines for careers in aviation, particularly for women and people of color. Her mission wasn't just to sit at the table. She was reshaping the table itself. Employees across Summit Sky Airlines began to feel the ripple effects of Ruth's leadership. Flight attendants spoke openly about how the new training programs gave them a deeper sense of empathy and understanding. Ground crew shared stories of feeling more valued and respected. Passenger satisfaction soared as travelers noted the shift in culture, a shift that prioritized kindness, respect, and professionalism. Summit Sky was no longer just an airline, it was becoming a symbol of progress. In stark contrast, Hannah Foster faded from the public eye. At first, she tried to rebuild her career in other cities, believing that distance would allow her to escape the controversy. But the stain of her actions followed her. Potential employers, regardless of location, recognized her name and associated it with the viral videos and headlines that had once dominated social media. Her polished image, once a point of pride, was now irreparably damaged. Ruth, however, remained focused on her mission. She didn't revel in Hannah's downfall. Instead, she used the incident as a teaching moment, one that highlighted the importance of empathy and fairness in customer service and beyond. During her first public address as part of Summit Sky's PR campaign, Ruth stood before the cameras and delivered a message that resonated deeply. Every individual, regardless of race, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness. There is no room for disrespect in this world, and there is certainly no room for it on our flights. Her words spread far beyond the airline industry. They became part of a larger conversation, one that challenged companies to take a hard look at their practices and address systemic inequality within their own ranks. Ruth's voice became a beacon of hope. Her leadership inspired not only Summit Sky employees but also people across industries who saw her as living proof that change was possible, that even the smallest acts of grace could spark lasting transformation. In the months that followed, Ruth's policies became models for other airlines. Competitors implemented similar training programs. Aviation conferences invited Ruth to speak about her journey and her work in reshaping corporate culture. And as her influence grew, Ruth remained the same humble woman who had once saved pennies for a notebook at Thompson's General Store. One afternoon, as Ruth walked through Summit Sky's headquarters, she noticed a familiar face. The young flight attendant who had spoken up for her on Flight 7119 approached, her eyes bright. "Mrs. Bennett," she said shyly, "I just wanted to thank you. I stayed at Summit Sky because of you. I feel proud to work here now." Ruth smiled warmly. "That means more to me than you know," she replied softly. For Ruth, that simple moment, a connection between two people, was the real reward. Her legacy wasn't defined by grand gestures or corporate titles. It was built on quiet strength, kindness, and the unwavering belief that even in the face of adversity, grace would always prevail.